Hello and welcome to the University of Birmingham's distance learning sustainable city students and also a wider audience who may be interested in this conversation. My name's Dr. Andrew Snow. I'm Assistant Professor in Urban Planning at the University of Birmingham, and I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Federico Savini, who's joining us from the University of Amsterdam, Associate Professor in Environmental Planning, Politics and Institutions, if I've got your full title right there, Federico.
Yes.
And we're going to be talking today about degrowth and cities and the relationship potentially existing now, but also existing in the future. I'm delighted to be joined by you, Federico. It's going to be hopefully a really interesting conversation.
Thank you, Andrew, for asking me and inviting me to this conversation.
Fantastic. So I thought we'd start off with sort of a bit of an easy question of where does your interest in degrowth come from and what drew you into this field?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. In fact, my relationship with the field of degrowth studies, if we can use it this way, starts way back already when I was doing my bachelor studies in sociology at the University of Urbino in Italy. So at that time, the discussion and the critical discussion about the economy was about globalization and the negative effects of globalization. And in Italy, we used to have movements such as the slow food or the slow city movements, but also, some different variations of the no global movements, the G8 in Genova, all those activities that were explicitly oriented to contest the somehow neo-imperialist or extractivist understanding of globalization that were basically growing at that time within mainstream economic thinking. And degrowth was at that time already in much smaller scale one of those alternative ideas about the way to organize the economy that would not destroy, the vernacular, traditional, ecological properties of place and cities. So at that time was really about globalization, at least in the environment where I was working. Then for a period of time, I did not engage with this concept, perhaps because it was not also possible, funding was not there, I was doing other studies. But now I came back to it because we see that there is more and more evidences that the current economic system is neither sustainable nor ecologically just. And differently from that time, we have really solid evidences of this. And we have solid and multidisciplinary evidences that span from economics, sustainability studies, engineering, sociology, and now, of course, also urban planning. And this is why I think this discourse is being expanded, but also brought back into the public debate today.
Yeah, that interdisciplinary and sort of multidisciplinary, the fact that it is a far-reaching sort of evidence base that is informing degrowth is a really interesting sort of perspective, and one that I think we'll pick up on as we move through this conversation. And it does link to this next question that I have for you in terms of a definition of degrowth, and in particular, what distinguishes it from other sustainability focused concepts, thinking about green growth and sustainable development as the two sort of core ones.
Yeah. So to understand the definition of degrowth proper, we need to, of course, define green growth, because degrowth exists and develops as a clear critique to green growth. And that's why we use the same word there, growth. Now, green growth is an approach to development, I would say, that equates the growth of GDP, the gross domestic product of a territory, a country, or a city, or a region, with living standards. So that's the basic assumption of green growth, that if you increase GDP, you also increase living standards. And next to it, it's green because in doing so, or through this process, you're also able to develop the tools, technologies that are able to address the ecological crisis in which we live, okay, or reach climate targets. So green growth equates GDP growth with well-being, and also sees technology as the solution to the ecological, let's say, consequences of this economic growth. This approach is not working. We know it by now. Therefore, we look for different approaches that critiques green growth. So degrowth is more specifically, I would say, an approach, again, to progress that explicitly says that we do need to focus on reduction of overall economic throughput, so all the stuff that is produced, consumed, and wasted in the economy, in order to reach climate targets. And by doing that, we need to put at the center justice, social justice. So that's a definition of degrowth: reduction and of obviously improvement of social justice. Okay. So it's a reduction and an improvement at the same time. Obviously, this definition is broad enough, but in specific, when people wonder what do we need to reduce, degrowth is pretty clear on the fact that we need to start from excess and from unnecessary forms of production and consumption, things that basically destroy the environment but do not bring collective well-being. Okay, so it's also about the sectors that need to be reduced. It's not a reduction overall for everybody in a flat way. I would like to define another concept here that is useful, is that of post-growth, which is also used a lot in academic and policy debate today. Post-growth economics or post-growth planning, post-growth, whatever you like, is just an approach that questions the belief of green growth. They say that it is true, they start from the assumption that it's true that GDP does not equate to social well-being, and also that technologies are not the solution to the climate problems. So when you question those assumptions, then you are already in the post-growth field of debate. But within that field, obviously, you can be more specific about how or what to do. And that comes degrowth, which is an agenda of reduction and improvement through, indeed, concern about social justice, excess, and unnecessary forms of production. So this is the three concepts that are a bit like kind of floating around out there often. And it's good to place them in relation to each other. When you take sustainable development, obviously, sustainable development, it's usually, let's say, considered as a vocabulary or a terminology that belongs to a field of study, international development in particular, and it's basically, from a degrowth perspective, is considered as a relatively mild variation of green growth, because it does claims that there is a particular development path that needs to be stimulated somewhere else, building on the technological infrastructural advancements that we think or we relate as a property of green growth. So it's just another field of debate, but very much attached to it.
Yeah, because I think that was something that I was thinking about as you were talking. Then is this idea of there always being expanding limits to growth, and sustainable development is very much predicated on that, in the sense that technological development will allow for continued economic growth, continued social development, and in such a way that doesn't break past sort of the ecological limits that. And it's sort of sustainable developments. This is where the balancing of pillars comes from, in the sense that we can always move one pillar up, and in doing so, sort of move another pillar up at the same time, and sort of we can sort of almost establish a good balance between these three pillars. Whereas I think maybe sort of degrowth perspective is thinking about those social and economic sort of pillars being within the ecological one, or the ecological one placing hard limits around sort of particularly economic growth. Okay, so thinking about this as sort of like relating to urban development, then sort of what do you think some of the implications are of degrowth for current and future urban development?
So when we look at how cities, or in particular urbanization, works, we know that urbanization globally at the moment is a motor, is an engine of economic growth globally. Okay, so the production of urban spaces, infrastructures, real estates, pipelines, whatever, is a component. It's a major component of global capital, and it is also how we valorize global capital. And by the way, it's also a way to destroy the environment and exploit labor. So urbanization needs to be taken seriously within the degrowth debate for this reason. Now, the implication of degrowth for cities are there are many, and they span through all kind of dimensions, from infrastructures to housing to green space to waste to sustainable energy. So I don't have now. I'm not going to start and tell you all the implications, but in general, one thing that one perspective on degrowth and urbanization that I personally developed in a paper tries to focus on three particular categories of effects or policies that needs to be taken seriously. Now, in a nutshell, the first aspect that degrowth problematizes of current urbanization is the relationship between built environments, dense built environments, or urban agglomerations, and their landscape, the hinterland, the periphery where the materials and labor that is necessary to sustain those environments are extracted. So the first thing we need to look at is that the relationship between the urban, what we understand as urban, and what we understand as non-urban, which is the industrial, the natural, the ecological, the infrastructural. Neil Brenner used the word operational landscapes of the urban. Basically, it's just another word to explain that what we see in a city exists because there are areas where resources and labor are exploited, extracted through infrastructures and through capital. So the first is to reconsider the notion of the city in a way that is expanded literally and includes territories that are considered non as urban. The second dimension that I think degrowth puts on the table for urban development is the aspect of how we govern land uses. So if we look at urban economies, we see that the management of land use, and in particular land values, it's crucial for the urban growth machine to sustain itself. Basically, we make money, we as planners, as government, we make money by creating value out of land. Okay, it's the essential DNA of urbanization. We need to question this aspect, and to do that, we need to look at the planning frameworks that are used in order to valorize land. And when we look at that, we obviously question private property, we question private use of public property, but we also question the relationship between informal and formal property rights, and so on and so forth. So we need to look at the DNA of urbanization from a point of view of land use planning, if we want to think in terms of degrowth. And the third aspect regards the fundamental rift, what usually is called as a rift between the urban and the ecological, the rural. It goes back to my very first point, but it goes back at the deeper level, because this rift is not only spatial, as I described, between cities and their hinterland, but it's also about humans, the way we perceive cities as spaces of humans, and the way we perceive cities as spaces for non-humans, more than humans. Okay, so this disconnection between the idea of a city as a space for humans, organized for human functions, and as a space for instead humans as part of an ecosystem, it's the fundamental epistemological shift that degrowth asks us to do. And this has major implications, because if we look at it from this perspective, we could say that cities are dead places, for example. Imagine a future in which a city like Amsterdam gets completely isolated from their outside because of a crisis, a war, or whatever. That city will not have any way to produce food, to provide basic care, to provide energy. That city will be just a bunch of buildings and people suffering. Okay. Because we organize cities just in perspective of human economic needs, those cities have no capacity to create basically healthy habitats. And we as animals, we need a healthy habitat. There is nothing healthy in cities like Calcutta. They are, for example, completely polluted, or Beijing with high degree of pollution, where people get respiratory diseases, stress, and so on. This is the result of the view of the city as a space that is purely organized for the economy. So these are the three dimensions that I think we need to work on. And each of these has a whole list of interventions, policies, measures that can be mobilized in order to achieve those goals. And of course, thinking in those three terms demands a completely different political sphere of the urban, or a different urban politics, where power structure are also different. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a this speaks to the transformational, like truly transformational nature of degrowth as a sort of as a project. It's not just incremental adjustments to an existing system. It is a replacement of this existing system that we have. So in terms of, I suppose, trying to think about what that means for your day-to-day experience of a city, what do you think some of the most, I suppose, significant differences? I mean, with this being so totalizing, or such a massive project, there's going to be lots of differences in terms of what a city would look like and feel like, and what the experience of a city would be like for if it was a degrown city. But what do you think maybe what some of the most significant differences would be for a city's inhabitants? And I suppose inhabitants can be interpreted quite broadly there, once it was operating according to degrowth principles.
So first of all, I would like to make clear that I would not use the word degrowth as an objective of a city. So there is no such a thing as a degrowth city or a degrowing city. There is just, what we can have is urban politics of degrowth, in the sense that a city would actually, the idea is that the city is a space of prosperity, well-being, and in fact personal growth, and the growth in contacts, convivial social contacts, activities, creativity, culture, healthcare, so on. So there's no such a thing as a degrowth city. Okay. And obviously the term degrowth does not lend itself to be an adjective that can be put on a specific thing. But what we can have is a degrowth-informed urban politics. So a process that puts at the center reduction of excess in order to improve societal well-being. So improvement of urban conditions for everybody. So that we can have as a political statement. Okay. And it's a political field of action. It's not a condition to be achieved. In fact, ideally, in the future, we might not even need the word degrowth, because we might have cities that are simply ecologically sustainable, socially just, very well livable, and healthy and happy. So we will not need that term. It will not be a degrowth city. It will be just the city. Now, your question was about the experience of the city if we look at the city from the point of view of degrowth. Now, here I would like to just say something clear. If we look at how cities are experienced in the everyday, we see that what we imagine as a degrowth value or degrowth profile is already there in the city. We have cities that are full of social practices and spaces where we provide livelihood, care, affordable housing. We do have them even in situations where there is a housing crisis. We do have cases where it's consumption is reduced, but there is an increase in social relations. We have a lot of areas that are high quality in terms of green, in terms of biodiversity, in terms of urban agriculture. We do have also planning practices that happens in cities regularly, where we provide common property rights of land, as I just explained. So we do have these things, but these things are at the moment marginal. Okay, they are marginalized. Actually, if they manage to survive repression, because that happens a lot, they tend to be either marginalized, so they are really made and kept as an isolated example within cities, or they are co-opted by capital and commodified. So we have situations where things happen for reasons of care, and then they turn into a business model. So this tension within the city happens all the time. So the experience of the city can be, for people who know how to look, can be already an experience that refers to what we imagine as a degrowth society. But it's not yet a politics of degrowth, because these experiences are marginalized, are secondary to mainstream politics. So in my work on strategic planning for degrowth, I really explain this, that we need to look at this existing experience in the city, and harness the potential for a broader degrowth politics. And that's the shift that we need to do, but it's not yet happening. Just want to say one last note. If there is a space where this shift can happen under conditions of climate denialism and delatism that we have now, that's the city. We see it happening, the city and the relation between the city and their surrounding environment. Okay. Because this is not clearly happening starting from the nation states, for example. They are moving completely in a different direction. So if we look at where the few seeds are, then we can see that dense urban environments with a particular type of lifestyle and a particular type of tensions between rich and poor are spaces where we can harness this potential, the radical potential of degrowth.
Yeah, so that really does answer this next question that I've had as well. I suppose maybe we can think about some of the sort of the more specific examples that you've conducted research on. My next question was going to be your sort of, based on your research on degrowth, which is centered on sort of, I suppose, these more the day-to-day functions of a city, sort of waste and housing, as well as more sort of political policy level, thinking about the case of Amsterdam's donut strategy. Sort of, what does your research tell us about the contemporary city's role in enabling and constraining the types of degrowth positive, or these, I suppose, the values and the sort of ways of life that we would associate with a healthy, happy, sort of and fulfilled urban sort of population? What does that tell us about sort of the contemporary city's role in sort of enabling and constraining those sort of that potential, both now and in the future?
So in my research, just as I explained before, I came across many practices that can be understood as performing degrowth in the everyday, right? I mentioned a few of them, like housing association, housing cooperatives, urban agriculture, slow mobility, sharing, and of course, networks of care. These practices are a bit everywhere, not only in cities, but what you see in cities is that there is a high concentration of these practices. Literally, there are more people performing them in their daily life. There is a high concentration and also higher flow of matter and relation in these practices. They connect to each other, they're linked, they meet, they help each other, they multiply, just as a, as an organism. Okay, an organism of the commons. That's simply how the commons work. Now, if we look at the city as a space of these practices, then the issue is how can we harness that potential to make this dense network of practices, a movement of pressure that changes the politics of the city. That's for me the key question. Now, the key question is not to make another housing cooperative, which is useful and beautiful, but the key question is how to harness the potential of the many housing cooperatives that are there to build a movement that can create pressure and change the regulatory institutional frameworks that shape urban spaces. Okay. Basically, how we do planning or how we do urban policy making. To do that, it's a challenge. And I think spatial planners have a strong role in this. And because they are used to actually work on the field and connect practices. But I think this is the challenge of planning at the moment from a Degrowth perspective. I may have forgotten the rest of your question, but can you, if it is not answering, can you repeat it, please?
Yeah, no, don't worry. Yeah, I think it does answer it, because basically I was asking about whether or not, well, what your research tells us about the contemporary city's role in sort of enabling and constraining sort of degrowth action. So sort of you talked about sort of all of the potential that exists within a city. I suppose contemporary, what are some of the, I suppose, constraints that a contemporary city, I suppose we're talking about contemporary global north cities, because
okay,
sort of there's definitely a difference there. But some
again,
of
here
list.
Maybe I can just make more precise. So it's not the city itself that constrains and enables these practices, it's the urban politics that are governing the city, okay? It's the urban power structures. So we do have cities where the urban power structure, because of many reasons, are kind of open to this diversity of common practices, diversity of degrowth related practices. In those cases, there are window opportunities, obviously, from the point of view of a political movement, because you can harness those practices and, connect to a certain degree of broader political discourse. So in some cities, this can happen. I also think that this doesn't mean that degrowth it's exclusively, useful in cities that are relatively well governed, whatever that means, or with a stable government. Not at all. In fact, also in cities where there is a very strong pressure by global capital and where is a very strong repressive government, we see these practices happening all the time, even in a stronger fashion. Okay. And there as well, there is a possibility of this movement, obviously using different means and different tactics. The question of tactics, it's also context-based. It depends really on the conditions. Okay. So it's difficult to explain how cities, which tactics degrowth movements and networks can use in different cities. Depends on the case. But that's in my view, the city itself, if we want to use the singular word city, it should be just as understood, not in a fetishist way, like something that is just, something that is out there and it's a city versus something that is not a city. No, it should be understood as an area where there is a high density of these practices. Okay. So it's very hard to distinguish it eventually from what is not a city, but there are understanding of density that can help. If you take major agricultural spaces, if you take major solar parks, these are not urban spaces because the density of this social relationship is much lower. So that's how I understand city in relation to these networks.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, because what came to my mind then was sort of some of the political sort of the outbursts of political sort of organizing that we've seen over the past maybe 10, 15 years or 20 years of sort of the Arab Spring, but also sort of like the 99% sort of organizations, completely different contexts, completely different sort of national contexts, responding to different political events, but demonstrating the power of the urban sort of space in terms of bringing people together and allowing them to almost spontaneously or very quickly respond to an issue. And I suppose then it becomes a question of how do you harness that potential in the moments that it arises. It's very would require quite a lot of strategic foresight, it seems.
Yes. Yes, well, this is a very good debate. I think this is a debate that the degrowth studies field needs to take very seriously and more explicitly. It's the relation between emergent movements, so something that happens at certain conjunctural moment in history, and organized movement. Is the typical debate between, for example, the role of political parties in relation to movements, the role between movements and institutions. This debate, which at the moment it's starting up because many of the big movements of the last 2 decades have somehow failed in the long-term perspective, then this debate is very important for degrowth as well. And I have to say, in my own work on strategic planning for degrowth, I always stated very clearly that at the moment within degrowth research, this question is either not addressed or it is addressed in a too vague and general ways, where we say that everything is useful. So that's the general kind of approach. Like we need coordinated, we need emergence, we need more reformist, we need cooperation, we need some move. This idea of everything is useful, it's a shortcut in my view it's a way around the question. It doesn't address the question. Obviously everything is useful, but then not everything gets to the goal of a movement. That's maybe to be clear about.
Yeah, so that, I mean, that's a really nice sort of precursor to my next question, which is sort of as part of this, the module that we're talking to feed into. Our students at Birmingham are going to be considering the role of spatial planning in contributing to sustainability within cities. So you spoke quite a lot about strategic spatial planning. You've actually written a sort of a degrowth critique of strategic spatial planning. I was just wondering if you could sort of almost summarize that for us.
So again, first of all, I'm not particularly interested in the role of spatial planning in the sustainability of cities. That's something that mainstream planning is doing already for decades. The word sustainability is kind of an empty word at this point. So I think we should not talk about that. We should talk about the role of spatial planning or the profile of spatial planning from a point of view of reduction of economic throughput of cities, and from a point of view of urgent and rapid increase of societal well-being by provision of essential services. First of all, housing. If we take that perspective, it is not only about sustainability, then planning needs to do some work. Because we planners, I take myself as a planner, until now, planning has been very much focused on, a green growth agenda, or rather what we call a growth management agenda. In summary, what was the mainstream ideology of planning until today, basically, is that, yes, we need to push economic growth, especially in urban areas, because they are the highest potential, as I said before, for capital valorization. And in order, when we do this, we will A, get the resources to pay for the green, and B, we will get the resources to pay for the social services. So growth management means control the ecological and social negative effect of urban growth through some policies that provides some degrees of green, renewable, and some degrees of affordable services. But this has failed. If you take any city, almost any large city in Europe, you will see that affordable housing is decreasing, not increasing. You will see that the environmental footprint of the city is increasing, not decreasing. I'm not talking about the CO2 emissions only within the city, obviously. I'm talking about the footprint as a whole. You see that there is no really, parts of cities are becoming more livable, but many of the cities are becoming more divided, with areas that are harder to live in and areas that are privileged. So what you see that this model is not work. So planning needs to take stock of this problem and change its perspective. Now, in my paper, I argue one very simple thing, is that the first thing that planning needs to do in order to do all of this that I just described is to enlarge its scope. So the scale of planning needs to enlarge to become regional, not urban. So we should not look anymore only at urban dense environment, but we need to look at regional networks and regional systems. And this can be very large system, often spanning across boundaries of provinces, regions, but also across countries. That's why I use the term myself, that of bioregion. It's a region that is not only defined by its economy, but also by its ecology. And ecology, as we organize it, spans through boundaries. So that's the first thing to do. Obviously, people can read more on my own writings, but I think that we should debunk this idea that degrowth planning is about the everyday small-scale practices. But as I said before, we should instead embrace the idea that degrowth in planning means enlarging the scale and connecting these practices. Think in terms of visions, long-term visions, of how a city can reconnect with the hinterland, how it can get more services, universal services within it, but also in a way that doesn't damage areas of production, so outside of the city. This will also, I think, trigger a different discourse and a different perspective on the way people within the region relate to nature and ecology. Because if you want to look for ecology in any dense urban environment, you're going to go out of the city. That's where it is. That's where we put it. Okay. So this is, I think, I would say the first argument I have. And there is a lot of work to do because we need a new visionary impulse, I would say, visionary impulse of planning at the regional scale. And planners have the tools to do that. In the past, we did this. In the past, in the 90s, in the early 2000s, many spatial planners were really working hard on the region because the region was the space of global investments. They developed the toolkits to think in terms of regions. And I think planners can look back at those toolkits and learn from them and I think reframe them and reuse them and recycle them for new purposes.
Interesting, because that I was just thinking in the UK we had like regional spatial strategies, which are exactly what you're thinking about and what you're talking about there, which were as part of the austerity sort of program, were done away with, and basically to try and sort of almost remove some of the perceived barriers to rapid sort of development, to try and grow the economy post financial crash. It's interesting then to sort of think about to what degree because you're talking about sort of recycling and reusing some of the techniques that planners have used in the past. Sort of, I think, and you have to forgive me if I'm mischaracterizing this debate, but there's a debate within sort of degrowth circles about the extent to which degrowth emerges out of existing systems and makes use of certain elements of that system, or whether or not things need to be sort of rebuilt from the ground up. So if we're thinking about sort of spatial planning, urban planning, it's planning as a profession, is it a case of almost we can slip sort of degrowth ideas and sort of that degrowth political agenda in the back door almost, if you understand what I mean, like sort of like attach it to things which can be sold within an existing system and sort of planning can be transformed quite subtly then? Or are we would it require a more, I suppose, deliberate rebuilding of planning as a sort of as an institution from the ground up?
Yeah, it's a good question, but if you think about it, it's also very paradoxical. Is there any? There is no such a thing as something that happens from the outside or something that happens from the moon, unless maybe yes, you may imagine some sort of invasion by somebody who comes and does a tabula rasa on the whole institutional and social system of a place and makes a new system up. I mean, this is something that we might not want, I would say. Um, so there's no such a thing as that. So everything that the degrowth planning could imagine starts from what is already there. So from appropriating, from contesting, appropriating, and also hacking, I would say really like modifying the existent in function of a broader perspective of a transition. And I just explained that this needs to start from those practices that are already there. Now, the reason why it needs to start there is also because the people themselves, the one that will at one point claim for a new system and do the new system, are people that learn to do that or gain the will to do that by doing it already today. You know, there's a lot of critique of prefigurative politics, right? And I agree with that critique because prefigurative politics is not enough in changing systems, in building long-term new institutions and structures. However, when you look at social movements, how they help, how they happen, you will
Sorry.
see. It's fine.
Sorry, Federico. I just wanted to just sort of step in there just to define prefigurative politics. Just in case sort of people might be unfamiliar with that. So prefigurative, if I've sort of again step in if I'm defining this poorly, it's the idea that someone does something that is new, and then in doing that thing that is new, they create the sort of the basis for that new thing to become more widespread. So it's almost like if you see someone living in a sort of in housing which is a sort of shared and common, sort of commonly owned, that has a prefigurative effect on the sort of the housing system, or it can do. Is that sort of
yes?
Is that
Yeah,
right?
that's a definition. Yes, prefigurative politics means basically that the most important thing for politics is to perform the future here and now. The future you want to see needs to be performed in the here and now, and that's the most important thing you can do to gain political power.
Yeah.
That's a strategy. I think that's not enough. If you perform the future here now and that's it, you might even can't be counterproductive, because sometimes you need a very strong organization and very fast movement to achieve some goals. But prefigurative politics should not be dismissed. It should be criticized, but also used, because, as I said, the big movements of change are somehow rooted in the existing practices of prefiguration. People who organize a big blockade of a highway to claim for example, to demand the stopping of fossil fuels. There are those people organizing that. There are people connected to the existing movements in the city. That's the school of the politics. The school of politics happens on the ground, on the everyday. So prefigurative politics is important, but it's not enough. But it should be taken very seriously. Yes.
And sort of our final question is sort of, I appreciate that we're running short on time, so we'll have a snappy sort of last question is sort of thinking about, and we touched upon it sort of quite a bit during this conversation. If we're thinking about sort of people who are organizing to try and enact this sort of like this political change that you're speaking about in order to sort of enable a transition towards a sort of a more degrowth valued sort of way of life in the cities. What are some of the sort of, I suppose, key strategic challenges for those movements, and how might those be overcome?
Yes. As I wrote in this paper on strategic planning for degrowth, at least from the point of view of spatial planning, I think we need to question two dynamics. The first is what I call synergy, and that's not a particularly creative term, but basically is the explanation, is the process that makes clear the codependencies and the complementarity between different movements within the city. And the first one should be the complementarity and interdependency between the social and the ecological movement. That's essentially one of the fundamental basis of degrowth as a movement. Distinguished, for example, from more, leftist eco-modernist approaches that focus on social justice and think that ecological targets comes next. So that's the first. The synergy, it's essential, but synergy can also happen vertically between movements and existing institutions. This doesn't mean integration of reformists, but it means reacting to institutional change when they happen. Be ready, okay? And the institutional changes as we see today are very fast. Anyway, the other aspect is regionalization. I already explained you why, from a point of view of spatial development, the region is the scale that works, that is crucial to build this vision of degrowth, in my view. I'm not going to explain again, but this means also that at the regional scale, we can work on synergy between movements that are focused on agroecology and movements that are focused on urban, because they are connected, agroecology, but also anti-extractivism, anti-mining, obviously movements against waste and contamination. These movements are very active just outside of cities within larger regions. These movements are clearly concerned, or they must be concerned, with the city, because it's the city that produces that contamination. Okay, or at least it's the city where the capital that invests in the industry that produces that contamination is located. So the regionalization for me is also another crucial aspect. So synergy and regionalization are for me the key challenges that movements can take into consideration.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Federico. That was really, really interesting and really insightful. I'm going to stop the recording now just to say thank you to all the students and wider audience who are listening to this conversation. And if you have any questions at all, please get in touch with me. My name's Andrew. It's a.snow@bham.ac.uk. You can get in touch with me that way. Fantastic. Thanks very much, Federico, and I'm lovely to talk to you today.
Thank you, Andrew. Have a good day.